And we continue on our coverage with the crisis in Puerto Rico. We go now from New York to Washington, D.C., where thousands of people gathered in the nation's capital protesting to bring awareness to the unjust laws that, according to many, have crippled and prohibited the growth of Puerto Rico. Our reporter, Alexandria Garcia, has the story.
Thousands gathered and marched in solidarity for Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C. to bring awareness to the unjust laws that, according to many Puerto Ricans, have crippled and prohibited the growth of Puerto Rico. To many marchers, it was a chance to bring awareness to the Jones Act, a law deemed unjust and outdated that puts an unfair economic burden on Puerto Rico during this distressing time.
Well, Puerto Rico is ingrained in me. We're very humble people, full of culture, and I was just appalled at the situation there and the lack of help. The fact that they're still without water and electricity. The fact that there's hundreds of people that have died because of the hurricane, and also because of the Jones Act that's pretty much suffocating them.
Guest speakers also took the stage by the Lincoln Memorial and spoke about what Puerto Rico meant to them, as well as what the government can do more effectively to help Puerto Rico receive the aid it needs.
I would like to see humanity. Some humanity would be nice. I would like to see the cancellation of the debt, the end of the Jones Act, and for Puerto Rico to really have the opportunity to create a sustainable future on Puerto Rico's terms.
In addition, political leader Emilio Vasquez spoke to us about how there shouldn't be a Jones Act in place at all and mentioned his resolution.
One of the first things, actually, the first House resolution that I made was House Bill 562. I'm asking the president and I'm asking Congress to give us 365 days, which is a year. Then as we started moving and progressing, I noticed that some things started shifting politically. So I did House Bill 563, which is asking Congress and the President of the United States, instead of giving us that 365, I did it for 5 years.
As thousands ended the march at the Lincoln Memorial, political leaders and community members united, showing their strength for the beautiful island of Puerto Rico. Reporting for BronxNet, I'm Alexandria Garcia.
Demand action, and we demand action ahora!
Well, thank you, Alexandria. Our next guest holds the island of Puerto Rico dear to his heart. He's also had the opportunity to participate in the Unity March. And joining us now, we welcome over the phone New York State Assemblyman of the 85th District and leader of the Bronx Democratic Party, Marcos Crespo. Assemblyman, good to have you.
It's great to be here. I appreciate the time.
Hey, thank you much for sharing with us. Listen, as we talk about the Unity March, obviously a lot of people gathering and converging on Washington, D.C. Tell us, do you feel like your voice was heard?
Well, look, I think it was important for the community to have an outlet, an opportunity to come together. It's always tough to mobilize people from around the country to D.C., but we had a nice turnout of supporters and folks from different states to send a message of unity and to demand justice for Puerto Rico on many levels. It's a wide range of issues that are affecting the island that we wanted to raise consciousness and awareness. And, it's also that we're competing for attention to this issue. We can't let Puerto Rico's plight, as well as that of the Virgin Islands, fall by the wayside and get lost in the news cycle. We have to continue to raise awareness until these issues are addressed and the federal government does what it needs to do.
Talk to me a little bit about your trip down. You were one of the initial people that went down. When the governor went down from New York and had that plane full of supplies and relief effort, you were standing right there with him. You traveled with him. Talk to us about where you see things today versus when you went the first time.
Well, look, the first trip that I went with Governor Cuomo, that was the first flight into Puerto Rico with any sort of relief after the storm hit. The storm hit on Wednesday. Through Thursday, we arrived Friday. And when we arrived, we saw extreme devastation to infrastructure. We drove through flooded communities where we saw people in kayaks checking in on neighbors. We saw the extent of the damage prior to the local authorities having any opportunity to really begin any work. And so, we saw the devastation firsthand, and it was just really hard to look at. But we also saw the resiliency in the eyes of the people in the ground and folks just willing to do what needs to be done to move forward. We heard from the governor then, who seemed extremely knowledgeable about Governor Rosselló, that is, about the steps that lied ahead for Puerto Rico, and he had a clear plan for how to execute that. In this last trip and since the storm, we now saw some of the repair work on the way. We saw what communities have had to do and the networks that have built out in specific neighborhoods to sort of help respond and fill the gaps for missing support. And when I talk about missing support, I'm talking about the lack of federal personnel on the ground, the fact that FEMA, the Army Corps, and FEMA have done the minimal amount of work, which is unconscionable when you think of the extent of the damage. And the fact that, folks on the ground, many residents in Puerto Rico feel that the municipal government as well as the central government haven't been as visible as they would like them to be. And so it's sort of two stages of this devastation, but people need to know that Puerto Rico is going to have a long road to recovery, and there's going to be many stages to this process. But right now, the most crucial is that Puerto Rico is given the resources it needs to rebuild without strings attached, and that the limitations in terms of federal law that continue to hinder economic growth in Puerto Rico need to be addressed.
Let's talk a little bit about Puerto Rico in depth a little bit more, because cameras have been there. Our cameras are there. That's the focus of today's show. Our cameras being in Puerto Rico, bringing people an in-depth look at what's happening over there. But honestly, we know the cameras pull out, and national media cameras have pulled out. Our cameras are out of there right now. But there are things that people aren't necessarily seeing that the cameras aren't telling. What are those?
Well, look, the extreme poverty in Puerto Rico. People need to know that many of the people they're seeing affected weren't just affected by the storm. If you had visited Puerto Rico and gone into these communities prior to Maria or Irma, you would have seen a level of poverty that you would not have expected from Puerto Rico. And people visit the island and they go to the touristic areas and they see a different story. But when you go to the neighborhoods, when you see what's happening to their economy, if you analyze the austerity measures that Puerto Rico had already implemented, the highest tax in the nation, when you look at the fact that our Medicaid system is the highest utilized system in the country, but the most underfunded, and the only one in the entire states or territories that has a cap on reimbursement, which led to people waiting for months for emergency surgeries because surgeons and doctors were leaving the island by the hundreds on a monthly basis. So there were so many depths, so many layers to the economic crisis and the problems in Puerto Rico. Add to that a 100-year storm, and it is complete chaos and devastation. And when the cameras pull out, like I said, this long road to recovery is going to require a lot of support, a lot of assistance, and I hope that if there's one silver lining to this tragedy, is that this has renewed a sense of involvement and attention by the diaspora and by the people around this country to understand what Puerto Rico has been going through and to realize that we need to do better as a nation to respond to a territory that we have claimed as our own but treated as second-class citizens, and that has to stop.
Well, walk us through the relief efforts, because we know that there are continuous relief efforts happening here in New York, across the country, to really help for Puerto Rico. Share with our viewers a little bit the urgency of continuing this relief efforts, because we know that once there's a devastation and there's a national tragedy, hearts and minds are definitely going to victims and trying to get those people the much needed supplies. But after a while, stuff does taper off. So talk to us about the importance of continuing this, given the fact of what we're seeing in Puerto Rico right now.
Look, I think, first of all, I am extremely impressed and grateful to what New Yorkers have done in particular, and people around this country. The diaspora and people out in the States have really responded. We have filled the gap in for the failure of the federal government to do its job. And people on the ground in Puerto Rico are extremely grateful to that help, whether it's the donations that have been collected and sent to communities, whether it's the people who have traveled into Puerto Rico to volunteer, to help with rebuilding, to giving things out to people in need. We have done our part, and we have done it extremely well. And it is important to continue to do it. There are challenging logistics in terms of that effort, because now with the ports being backed up, with the cost of sending goods, and the fact that now the airlines are working, but there's so many people leaving the island, it makes it just difficult to transport goods into the island, to get it to folks. The companies that do containers are now backed up with work. They're having to give you longer wait times for things to get shipped in and delivered. And so there are logistical difficulties. So I do encourage people to continue to, raise resources and things like that. I think at this stage, more so than the emergency supplies, if people want to be helpful, it is going to be funding, and no amount is too small to support the nonprofit community in Puerto Rico who are doing work in many towns and communities that are the poorest. If there is any hesitation to supporting government-run initiatives, they should look at the nonprofit community. There are plenty of great organizations that could use resources to help rebuild and organize those neighborhoods. There's a lot of ways in which people can help, but also the advocacy. We have to remember that Puerto Ricans are American citizens without a vote. And we can't vote in general elections, and the president knows that, and Congress knows that.
Does that make a difference at all? I mean,
we are now at the mercy of the diaspora and the people who live in the States being the voice and the vote on behalf of Puerto Rico.
I cut in and asked you, does it make a difference? And they're telling me to wrap up, but I want to get your take on this before. Does it make a difference, given the fact that you can't vote, that this plays a part in possibly the response, the relief effort, and the possibility of troops actually pulling out earlier than most people want?
There's no question in my mind that there is an element of racism involved in that. If we were an island of mostly Caucasian-looking individuals, we would be treated very differently. The fact is that we are people of color, that we speak Spanish, that we have our own identity, and despite efforts over the last 100 years to take that away, we have held on to that. And so Puerto Rico is a very unique place, but it deserves better as American citizens who have died in every single war on behalf of this country and our freedom. We deserve better than the treatment they've gotten. We have to reform the Jones Act to allow us to have a real economy. We have to give Puerto Rico more autonomy. We have to give them the resources to get themselves out of this economic crisis as well as this disaster, to rebuild without strings attached. And this is, in the silver lining of us is that there's an opportunity to do right by these American citizens. The president has chosen not to do that, to do the minimal amount of work, and to then have the audacity to demand a thank you for something that he has failed. Understand that very few lives were lost because of the storm. Hundreds have been lost in the aftermath. And that aftermath is the responsibility of the President of the United States and federal authorities to respond, and they did not do that.
All right, Assemblyman Marcus Crespo, we got to leave it there. Thank you so much for sharing with us here on Open on this very special edition talking about the island of Puerto Rico. Thank you so much.
Appreciate it.
All righty. Well, in other news, Hostos Community College held a panel discussion analyzing the Puerto Rican migration over the years, including the future migration of Puerto Ricans due to the aftermath of Hurricane Maria. Reporter Ashley Tiffany brings us the story.